All right. Welcome to the show. Is our audio good? All right.
Sounds good.
Awesome. Welcome to the show, guys. Today we have a very special guest, author Kelvin Chin. Should I say doctor?
No, just call me Kelvin. That's good.
The spiritual doctor is in the house.
Yeah, exactly.
Kelvin Chin is an author, meditation teacher, and life afterlife expert. His first book, Overcoming the Fear of Death Through Each of the Four Main Belief Systems, is a bestseller. His second book, Marcus Aurelius Updated 21st Century Meditations on Living Life, is a collection of 67 essays ranging from emotions, life principles, meditation, and the spiritual. His third book, After the Afterlife, Memories of My Past Lives, describes in detail how his past life memories that reach back 6,000 years has resurfaced over the past 45 years and what they have taught him about himself and how our minds continue from lifetime to lifetime. Like the Akashic Records. Yeah.
Fascinating.
Kelvin is executive director and founder of the Turning Within Meditation and Overcoming the Fear of Death. I think we all have a little of that, even though some of us may not admit it, right? But it is something that we should talk about and face in conversation and what we're about to do. Fear of Death Foundation, and is internationally recognized meditation teacher featured in Business Insider, Newsweek, Kaiser Health News, and has taught meditation at West Point and in the U.S. Army, including the demilitarized zone in Korea, or the DMZ. Kelvin has been meditating for 52 years and has taught meditation for 50 years to thousands of people over 60 countries. He is a graduate from Dartmouth, Yale, and Boston College Law, has lived in over 7 countries. So this is not just somebody off the street, guys. We got somebody with a pretty heavy resume.
It's a guy off of many streets.
Yeah. Got
Many streets.
Rolled out of the ditch, dusty and dirty.
Yes. Awesome.
Right.
Welcome, Kelvin.
Yep.
It's a pleasure
great to
having
be
you on
here
our
with
show,
you.
and thank you.
Yep.
Yeah, good to be here.
Yep. And so during this episode, we're going to focus more on his latest book, After the Afterlife. And Amazon asked the questions, what happens after we die? Do we ever become human again in a different body, in a different culture? And so Kelvin's memories, which reach back 6,000 years, indicate that, in fact, we do. One review of the book from Amazon says, this book is a brilliant recollection of lives lived in the past. It will make you think and possibly even trigger those memories that are stored within your own subconscious. That's what it did for me. Anna Maria Martin said that. So it's a fascinating conversation, and I'm looking very much forward to learning more about you. I dug through your book over the last hours, and it started triggering stuff for me, I have to say. It just created kind of a new perspective about this kind of single clip in a long movie that the soul goes through, different scenes.
Yeah.
And it's very fascinating. And just to kind of parlay off of your comment, Mahesh, like that, you know, the fear of death is something that a lot of people have. I'd say everyone has, and it's something that a few people are working on escaping from. It is.
Maybe escaping is not what we should be doing. And Kelvin, I'll let you.
That's why I use the word overcoming. That's why I use the word overcoming.
Okay.
Because it's not that we're running away from it, because everybody's been trying to run away from the elephant in the room, and the elephant is so big. The elephant ain't leaving the room, folks. That's the thing.
Right.
So, it's like, how can we overcome it and live with the fact that we all know we're going to die, physically, biologically die at some point? And I say physically, biologically die because, my experience, obviously, as you've indicated already, is that we don't really die. We transition to a different, you could say, different vibratory, state of functioning, but we're still energetic. We're still energy. And my experience is that we're still identifiable. We're still in individuality. So we don't merge into some cosmic soup, I call it. We don't merge into some cosmic soup. We retain our individuality. We know who we are. Maharishi, we share that in some of our, You're in My Past history. He still knows who he is. He still can communicate with us and so forth from the other side. We don't lose our individuality. We continue, but we biologically die. So I view death as part of life. Really, it's and the end of our biological life is that, I call it, that most intimate moment of our life.
Right.
Most intimate because you're with yourself. That's it. It's you and you right at that moment. Right.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So a question, apart from overcoming the fear of death, how does meditation contribute to a more balanced, productive, and enjoyable life?
Yeah.
I mean, how does it play into?
You guys have been meditating a long time too. And so we know as meditators that it improves us in all different ways. Because why? Because essentially the simple answer is that meditation is connecting ourselves with ourselves. And so what better way to improve all aspects of one's life than to connect with oneself, within oneself, deep within oneself, and strengthen oneself from the inside out. That's why I call it turning within. If we turn within and we connect with ourselves, everything on the outside is going to be better, bottom line, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And then as far as the fear of death is concerned, I really, I've talked to so many thousands of people about their various fears about death, and everybody has their own unique perspective on it, obviously, their own belief system. And I accept everybody's belief system wherever they're at. I don't try to change their belief system about it, but I help them look at it from different angles. And the bottom line is, if you really distill down the fear of death, the one thing, it's really the fear of uncertainty, because people are wondering, what's going to happen after I die? Even if you are a devout believer in heaven or the afterlife or nirvana, whatever your cultural or religious belief, however it languages, it doesn't matter. You're going to know when you know, and you're not going to know until you biologically shut off, and then you're going to know.
Right.
Totally. And I think that creates an opportunity for people, like in the practice of dying, like something that I learned when I was a young man in martial arts was this ability to overcome that fear of death by facing it and challenging yourself in different ways. And the value of that, the strength and that kind of completeness of the relationship between you and you. Like it is, like this life is an inside game. Doesn't matter. There's nothing out there that's going to move you forward. It's all between you and you. And you have to work on that every day, or else you're going to come back and back and back and not really make any progress. And so for me, as I've gotten older, like this morning we got up early, 5:30, and we did sauna, and we did some Wim Hof breathing technique. And in the breath suspension, for me, I find that you've got this point where you're going through fear and you're facing your own death, and you have to, your mind is going, breathe, and you're going, nope, it's all right. And when you go through that, then it's super empowering, and that cascades into everything.
It's interesting you say that, Tony, because when you were doing that exercise and you felt like you just articulated like you're going through your own death experience, in the sense that's the whole. The way I frame when I talk to my students about this fear of death issue, it's really the fear of uncertainty, and uncertainty exists everywhere all the time. I don't know if I go to Trader Joe's if they're going to have my raw whole cashews, they're going to have the Brazil nuts that I want.
Right.
They may be all out, and sometimes they are, because I'm not the only one who's buying this stuff at Trader Joe's. And so this unknown, this uncertain, but that doesn't freak me out. Whereas the fear of death freaks a lot of people out.
Correct.
Because they think it's a termination, and I understand why. But even then, even people who have had an NDE, a near-death experience, I say they're not going to know till they know either, because they had a near-death experience. They actually didn't have a death experience and come back. That's why it's called a a near-death experience.
Mm.
The bottom line is, aren't we always, to your point, Tony, aren't we always really going through a death experience in a sense? Every millisecond of our life is really a death and a rebirth. You can, and that's an intellectual thing that sometimes I'll say to people, but the key in terms of the meditation, back to your point, Mahesh, is the turning within and connecting with oneself, because when one connects with oneself, one dissipates, one kind of minimizes or reduces this energy, the fear energy, as it relates to death and the uncertainty of life and so forth. Why? Because when we get out of what this psychology professor back in the 1960s, one of my students in the 1970s told me this, that his professor said, you guys incorrectly think your mind is like a little 8-inch bucket with about 10 ping pong balls bouncing in and out. Those are your thoughts and emotions and experience. He said, no, your mind is huge. It's this big Houston Astrodome. He was at the University of Houston in Texas, a psychology professor. And he said, no, your mind is huge. It's this vast, that our mind is this huge football stadium, but we're not getting out of the bucket. So meditation allows us to get out of the bucket. We expand our conscious capacity for experience. Fears tend to dissipate. Because why? We start to realize we're so much more powerful than we thought we were. And we can handle whatever, including uncertainty, including the uncertainty about death and dying. It just melts away.
I have a question. So like in the movement, is it only, sorry, I know we're not there, but that thought came to my mind. So I just want to ask
go ahead. I'll fill in the context if you ask the question. Go ahead. Yeah.
Is meditation the only practice that is used within the Maharishi organization, or do they actually incorporate other things like the breathing techniques and all these?
Well, first of all, you got to understand my background. So I was with Maharishi from 1970 into the late 70s. 1978 was the last project he asked me to do. He asked me personally to come and do a teacher training in Fairfield, Iowa, at Maharishi International University, and recruit and train Chinese Americans and take them to China. That project didn't fully, birth, so to speak. Okay. We got partway into it, and he changed his focus, as he is wont to do every once in a while. Those are people who ever worked with him up close and personal know that he did that a lot. But so my point is that I don't know. I don't know what they're into these days. I still have fond memories and thoughts and feelings towards the organization, but I left in the late 70s, so I don't know what they're up to lately. I hear from hearsay from friends, but I mean, we did pranayama back then. We did alternate nostril breathing back then, and we did yoga asanas, and said yoga asanas, and we did what was called a round, right? That's right. That's the Beatles chorus in Dear Prudence, round and round, right? It's the chorus because she was rounding at the ashram, when the Beatles were there in India. Anyway, so we did a lot of rounding back then in the 70s, but I don't know what they're doing in terms of, yeah.
Okay.
So was your question like just about the TM organization or about the transcending process?
Because when I went through, which is most recent in the 2000s at MUM, I felt like everything was a bit watered down. It was like you could only do the TM, and they would advise against you looking at other things or peeking out into the world for other techniques and yoga practices. They were very against that, which I thought was weird, because the what my dad raised us was, question, look, seek, and then I get to Fairfield, and it felt like this little bubble that had me. I'm not saying anything wrong. I'm just saying I noticed a shift in the perspective in the modern MUM, the modern version of it. It felt almost dogmatic or trapped.
Yeah, you guys have much more up close and personal recent experience than I do, because my experience with the TM organization is, 45 years ago or 50 years ago or whatever. But I heard that, and I kind of sensed that, and that's, they started going off in different directions in the late 70s, and then especially in the early 80s when I was in law school. And so I was still I would go to the TM centers back then in the early 80s, and I still have friends today who are involved with it. So I have nothing bad to say, but they started going off in other stuff, gotten into a lot of other stuff. And I just was like, okay, see you later. It wasn't the direction that I wanted to move in. I wanted to stay more focused on teaching the meditation process and so forth. So as you guys know, I've left the organization. I don't have any bad things to say about it, but it was just, I wanted to be just a meditation teacher, and I've made it easier, and I've removed all the cultural trappings from the teaching. And I've made the teaching easier, because what I did notice, even when I was teaching in the 1970s, when I was teaching with the TM organization, I would notice certain things that were cognitively dissonant. You know what that term means? There were certain things that were inconsistent in the teaching that I've removed and made consistent. I mean, I'll give you one example right now. I mean, it's just a kind of a simple, and people will kind of laugh about it. But I checked in with somebody who used to be on international staff then, who taught teacher training, along with Maharishi. Obviously he was the main teacher, but he had staff, who were, also running meetings and teaching and so forth as part of the teacher training program. And one of the simple things was, you always have to come back and think the mantra, at least before the end of your meditation. And what if you fell asleep during your meditation? Then when you fell asleep, you had to wake up and you had to meditate again. This was, I don't know if it still is part of teaching, but this was part of the teaching in the 70s. And I would be so exhausted. I started meditation not because of anything spiritual, by the way. I was not into spiritual stuff. I started because I was anxious. I was a 19-year-old stressed out college kid, and I thought I was going to flunk out of Dartmouth, and I had to do something. So I learned to meditate, and TM just turned my life around. It was awesome.
Yeah.
Wow.
But one of the things was, I would fall asleep all the time during or after my meditation. And it's like this guy would fall asleep all the time. And so the instruction was, well, when you wake up, you gotta meditate, because meditation was defined as thinking the sound, thinking the mantra, what I call the sound. I don't call it a mantra anymore, but you guys know what I'm talking about.
Right.
The mantra, thinking the mantra. And then, so I would get in these cycles where it'd be like, okay, it's 10 o'clock. Okay. I started meditating at 5 this afternoon, and I got to keep meditating. And then I fall asleep again. Okay, when's this going to end? So it was crazy. So that to me is like a classic, really, you got to get on with your life. And so I've redefined how I think about meditation, and how I teach my students. I say, it's not about thinking the sound. It's not about that. The sound is just a simple tool. It's just a vehicle. It's not a magic pill, and it's not a magic vibration, like a lot of people think who teach mantra meditations. They make it sound like a magical thing. No, Maharishi never talked about, he would imply sometimes, but when you were up close and personal with him, one-on-one, he'd say, you use any of them, it's okay.
That's the thing I wanted to come to, what he just said, was that Maharishi himself was a very easygoing guy and open-minded on many levels, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't this rigid thing where he was like a Hitler, a spiritual
rigid,
Hitler.
That's been my experience too,
Yeah.
is that like the regimen that they prescribe on campus and through the TM centers and whatever is actually very limiting and keeps people kind of,
now in
I'm
your
not
book,
criticizing, but it kind of keeps people kind of a little bit trapped. For me, TM was a touchstone that I was able to lift off into all these other possibilities and fascinations and explorations of myself. And my mantra, like I still practice, it's not the TM that I learned on that first day when I learned 30 years ago, and that my first experience was amazing using the mantra that was given to me by my initiator. But now it's way different. It's evolved, and that sound, that vibration has evolved with my own circuitry.
Well, here's the thing. Look, if you were in the room with him, even in 1,000 people, I'm not just talking in a room with him alone like I was sometimes when I was one of the senior leaders in his organization at that time, back then. But even if you were in a room with 500 or 1,000 people, you would have heard him say many times, the sound can change in all different ways. And it's not about it being always absolutely the same this way or that way. He said that, personally heard him say that hundreds of times. So a lot of the essence of the teaching may have been a little bit, skewed this way and that way. And that happens it happens in any institution. It doesn't matter if it's a chemistry class, a meditation group, or a political group, or a whatever group. It happens in groups. And it's like the story, it's like you sit around in kindergarten, you tell a story, the 25 kids sit in a circle and you pass it around. It's like, well, it comes back to you and you go, that's not what I said.
Yeah. Perfect.
So that happens all the time.
Totally.
Right.
Oh, I don't want to, bang on only the TM organization, because it happens to every institution.
Correct.
One thing that I will say about what you said, Tony, is that my experience is that the way Maharishi taught meditation, which I still embrace, in terms of it being effortless and easy, to me, that's what he is going to be known for. I think, my opinion, this is my opinion, my conjecture, 500, 1,000, 5,000 years from now. I think that's the thing that historically he's going to be known as revolutionizing, as that guy who, and I say this in my books and in my lectures, I give him full credit for being the guy who revolutionized meditation for after millennia, maybe millions of years. We don't know, but we know millennia for sure, but he's revolutionized it for tens of thousands of years. He's made it easy, not concentration, not focus, not controlling the mind, not trying to clear the mind of thoughts. That's huge. And to me, whether you do other reef breath techniques, you do Reiki, you do this or that, to me, I'm an inclusive guy. But the however is the turning within in an easy and as effortless way as possible is the primary factor that seems to be missing in a lot of spiritual practices
across the board. Yeah, not just the movement. This is in general.
No, across the board. Across the board. And then and when you say the movement, you're talking about the TM movement, because other people view themselves as the movement. You know what I mean?
Right. Correct.
Right. Heard about that.
But yeah.
Tell us a little bit now. Let's pivot towards the book slightly about past life experiences. Did you have experiences or past lives where you encountered or had relationships with who we know as Maharishi Mahesh Yogi?
Yeah,
and what
I
were
did.
those?
I did, and completely caught me by surprise, because I started having, first of all, as I said, I didn't believe in any, I didn't know what spirituality was. If you asked me when I was a 19-year-old kid, when I learned to meditate, what spiritual, I thought spirit, what, ghosts? That's what I thought. It was spirituality, does that have to do with ghosts? That's what I thought, 19 years old. So I had no clue. And then I started obviously experiencing my greater sense of self, my expanding my capacity consciousness wise through the meditation. I thought, oh, that's interesting. And then in 1977, I had my first past life memories. That's when that first started happening, after about 7 years of meditation. And it just happened on one of the TM courses. I was over in Wildesville, Switzerland, in the Hotel Berghoff, doing some of those energy that they call the TM City program. People who don't know what that is, it's basically Kundalini energy moving exercises. And we were doing that, and then I flipped over my back and I was being crucified upside down. So that was the first thing. I was like, what? But to answer your question, years later, it was in 2014, in the run-up to the 30th November talk that you guys have seen. People who don't know, they're listening. What?
We'll add links.
We'll drop a link.
Yeah, we'll drop links, and I'll probably put up
there. Yeah, 30thnovember.com. Anyway, it's a talk, and Maharishi, a number of us were getting communications from Maharishi and others from the other side. People who don't know, Maharishi died in 2008 biologically, and this started happening in early 2014, Maharishi started communicating with like a lot of different people, and it's one person in particular who actually gave the talk, George Hammond, but he contacted 20 different people I didn't know from around the world, because people would hear that I was organizing this event, and then they would find me on Facebook, or somebody give them my cell phone or whatever, and I get these phone calls from people around the world saying, "Maharishi just visited me in my dreams last night." I was like, "What?" And like, so all these people I didn't know. I knew at least 20 people who I didn't know. But anyway, during one of those, during one of my meditations, and I'm not sure if I was meditating or if I was resting, I think I have the story in the book, so I tried to remember, like, when did that happen? It was in 2014, and the group on the other side, they called themselves the movement because they wanted to move spirituality in a more positive direction. So you got Maharishi, who used to be John the Baptist. Those of people don't know that. He used to be John the Baptist and Elijah in previous lifetimes.
Oh, wow.
And Jesus and Jehovah and Shankara, who used to be Vyasa in a previous lifetime. So Shankara, I think most of the listeners probably know who Shankara is, but Vyasa, they look up Vyasa, Vyasa is how the Sanskrit is written, but Vyasa wrote the Mahabharata, and within the Mahabharata is the Bhagavad Gita. So most listeners probably know what the Bhagavad Gita is. So Vyasa, aka, later lifetime Shankara, all part of this group, started downloading this information to a whole bunch of different people. And George in particular, but a lot of us got, and John Moore, John got communications from them as well. Anyway, during one of those, they were talking to me about lighting. Lighting, it was like a logistical conversation with me about how they wanted the lighting and how many cameras they wanted in the room in Alexandria, Virginia, where the event was being held. And as you know, because you saw the live stream, Tony, it was live streamed and everything. And anyway, they wanted 5 cameras, and it was like very specific. And they told me the reason why. Anyway, at the end of this logistical conversation they're having with me after my meditation, I'm sitting there alone in my apartment in Austin, Texas. And I'm going, what? Okay. And then one of them says, "Oh, and by the way, Maharishi wanted us to tell you that you were his son in another lifetime." And I'm like, what? I thought he was a monk. Like he was a householder. He had kids, family. What? Anyway, so then, so I was incredulous, because my knee jerk to everything spiritual tends to be skeptical. But then it was like, after like maybe the next couple of weeks, I started having memories, and it was not real pleasant memories, to be honest. It was memories of being his son, and he was very demanding. Let's just.
Was he in India? Was he in India? Were you his son when he was still Indian, or was it a different part of the world?
He was Muslim. We were in
wow.
We were in the Middle East. He was a Muslim leader. I don't remember his name. I don't know exactly what his position was, but we were upper class. I had a harem of women. That's what I remember. Anyway, but he was my father. But what I remembered about him was that he was very, what was the word? He was very demanding of me in my spiritual pursuits. And he wanted me to be spiritual in the way he wanted me to be spiritual, as opposed to the way I wanted to be.
Right.
And I wanted to be me. Right.
Typical son.
Yeah. Typical father putting expectations on the son.
Yes. That's right. Thank you. The expectation word. Exactly. And it was very, and it was not pleasant. It was, that's what I remembered. It was not a pleasant memory. And interestingly, after the 30th November talk that happened in Alexandria, Virginia, obviously on 30th November in 2014, I anticipated, given that I knew generally what the content was going to be, I figured, well, people are going to want to talk about this stuff afterwards. So it was basically about the history of spirituality on planet Earth in the Judeo-Christian, Islamic, Vedic traditions, because you got representatives of all these leaders from all those traditions given a download about why they did what, when, over the last 10,000 years. And so I reserved a conference room in the hotel, figuring, oh, people could probably want to get together afterwards, after the meet, on the evening of 30th November, and then December 1st, and so forth. So I had, and then a lot of people, flew out or drove away if they were local and so forth on December 1st. So the morning of December 1st, I get there early because I'm organizing all this stuff, and I get to the conference room 8 in the morning, and there's not a lot of people there because it's 8 in the morning on a Sunday, And so, but I get there early to open up the conference room in the hotel and everything. And maybe there are about 12 or 15 people, eventually it's like 25, 30, 40 people, whatever, in the room later. But dribbling in, after waking up. And John Moore is sitting there. So John Moore, the people who don't know, the audience, John Moore was the leader in the TM organization after I left. So I didn't know John, and I met John through Facebook. Somebody told him that, hey, there's this guy, Kelvin Chin, organizing this event, blah, 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 you can connect with him. That's how I met John in September, I think, or October, I'm not sure. September, October, I met John on Facebook. Well, now I met John face-to-face the day before, at the lecture, and he's sitting next to me in the conference room. And he's sitting there, and he's talking in the group about this aspect of Maharishi sometimes being a little bit, creating certain expectations, as you say, and being a little bit pushy, we'll just say. We're talking about business meetings of senior leadership in the TM organization that John experienced in the 80s and 90s, in the early 2000s, before Maharishi died, obviously. And it was long after I'd left the organization, right? So John is sharing this with the group of 12 or 15 or 20 people in the room or whatever. And then Maharishi, this is the only time I've ever experienced had an experience like this way. Maharishi came into my body. I felt his energy. It's the only way I can describe it. Maharishi came up, I felt his energy in me, and like my body's vibrating, it's like, what the fuck we're going on here? And and I knew it was Maharishi, and he said, tell John. And I knew exactly what he meant. He just said, tell John. So it's all telepathic, right? And it's like, and he's in me, and then he left. And he said, tell John. So what he meant was to tell John. Now, I had only told George about this experience that I just told you about Maharishi being, the whole thing, them telling me that from the other side that Maharishi was my father and all this. And so, because John was at the point in his story with the group talking about Maharishi being difficult to be with or work with sometimes, right? And so that's when Maharishi popped in. He said, tell John. And then I got so emotional. I started to tell him. I started getting so, I just started to talk, and I got so welled up with emotion, I couldn't finish, and I had to come back until later. I had to I had to collect myself, I reached
again,
over.
So John, we hope you're listening. We love you, John. So for those listening, you can check out this event at 30thnovember.com. It occurred 30th of November in 2014. Is that correct? It was in Virginia after Maharishi had passed, and it'll create some context around you. And if you're, times have changed. A lot of people were told not to go, not to view, that were part of the TM organization. So do your own thing. But I encourage everybody to take a look, because it's going to, switch up your perspective a little bit. So tell us now about the mechanics of these memories of these lifetimes coming back, how they started, how they accelerated, and what could someone like me be looking for in my experiences, my dreams, my thoughts, perceived memories that could potentially be past life.
Yeah, you'll see, in the book, it's really the phrase that I use is like a jigsaw puzzle. It's like a whole bunch of jigsaw puzzles. I think it's a really good analogy, because it's like a jigsaw puzzle. These past life memories are like jigsaw puzzle with no box cover. You get a jigsaw puzzle, you get 500,000 pieces, and you get a box cover, and you kind of know how things are going to eventually look. But when you're getting past life memories, you got no cover,
no context.
Yeah. No context. And so I get these pieces. I get one from 2,000 years ago, you know, in 1977, and then a few months later, I get one from 2,300 years ago, like, you know, even before that, and then, you know, a few weeks later or a few months later, you know, I get something from, you know, 250 years ago. It's like all over the map. You know, I'm getting pieces. And at the time, for me, and again, your experience could be very different from mine. I'm just giving you, illustrating my experience. Of
course.
But, you know, I'd have to, does that go with this one, or does that go with this puzzle over here? Because each lifetime is like a 100 million piece jigsaw puzzle. So it's like, which puzzle is it going with? And so over the years, you know, and then I would piece together stuff. And, you know, one of those that I was talking to you guys about earlier, you know, I'd been a leader in Prussia, and I got that in 1978 or 79 or something, but I didn't know who I was or whatever. Just I was a leader, whatever, in the place called Prussia. And then later in 2014, so that's like 1979 or 78 to 2014, you know, I get nothing, no memories of anything other than leader in Prussia. And then later I triangulate and figure out, it becomes clear to me who that was. Right? Yeah, that's you know, part of that Charlie Lutes story we talked about.
Interesting.
Which we can get into. Yeah. So it's just like pieces like that. Yeah.
And I'd like to share a story if you don't mind. As a very, very young person, a young boy, before I was 10, I lived in Topeka, Kansas. And there was a mound there, a burial mound called Burnett's Mound. Burnett was an Indian chief that was supposedly buried there. And I felt very proud of my Native American heritage. Mm-hmm. But I'm not Native American. And right. I had recurring dreams of getting stabbed in my back. And I would wake up at night arching my back.
Right.
And I didn't know what that was, but I always continued to feel this affinity and kind of this knowingness about Native American tradition and stuff like that. And, you know, then, you know, I can only assume that was definitely like within the last several hundred years that I lived and roamed on those plains and hunted and whatever and was murdered by what I think it was my brother at the time. I have no idea why I thought these things, but you know, from our and you know, another lifetime or a fantasy that I thought about myself. I'm like, I'm proud of myself for this, but it's totally out of context. Was like I've had some from ancient Egypt. I had one as like a Japanese samurai, like guardian of, you know, royalty. And now it's all kind of coming together for me. Like, oh, okay. So those are real experiences. And that's why my potential now is so much greater, because I can recall all of the mistakes that I made in all of these lifetimes and move forward with so much access.
When I was reading your book this morning, Kelvin, and I was going through your stories actually also created a trigger in me. Because as you were describing, you know, where you went from being a slave, well, you'll tell people about that, but I thought that was cool, because people like to fantasize and think that, oh, your past life must have been this great thing, or like, you know what I'm saying? But they don't want to face the reality that we've all been so many different things and so many different,
so many different things, so many different stations in life. We call it slave and leader. Slave and leader, and so many different ethnicities. I've been all ethnicities and all different religions, so we can talk about that.
Yeah.
But your point, Tony, that's what I was getting to. Is like, you know, I have dreams, I'll have visions. I've had what you're describing is what I call recognition memories, where I would go to the museum, and why am I attracted to the Egyptian mummies all the time? Why am I attracted to the medieval armor all the time? Why is this, you know, there's these deep emotional roots and patterns that somehow trigger my memories and so forth. And that's what's causing me to have the vision or have the recognition memory or something. You know, when I was 20 years old, I went to the catacombs, and I remember coming out, and I this was, you know, 1971, so I didn't have any past life memories or anything, but I went there, and I came out after the tour, and I went, I've been there before. And I'd never been to Europe before. I'd never been on a jet airplane before. Never mind to Rome, to the catacombs on the Appian Way. But I thought, I'd been there before. This is weird, you know? And I had this weird time warp experience where I didn't know if it was 5 minutes or 5 hours I'd been there. I was in a time warp, you know? Those kinds of experiences, or going to a place, like you say, you know, going to North Dakota and never being there before, but finding out later maybe you lived there before.
Pretty cool.
But not the same time.
That's awesome. That's the realization I came from all this setup with the meeting and getting to know about Kelvin, was that I thought, like, I'm not connected, I'm not tapped into anything, I'm not experiencing any of the stuff you guys are talking about. But then as I started reading his book and we started prepping for this, I started realizing, wait a minute, I have been having visions and feelings like this. I just haven't been paying attention. I haven't been tuning in, right?
Yeah.
And that's the key, the tuning in.
Tuning in. It's just and they tend to be, from my experiences, they tend to be often, not always, very emotionally charged. There's some emotion connected to that. And it could be positive or negative. It doesn't have to be negative. It could be positive too. But like I have a friend, and I help some of my students, you know, open up and look at their stuff. And she said, I want to open. I said, well, she said, I got this really unusual connection to certain kind of jewelry. And so I said, well, what's it look like? And she said, well, I said, go online and look and see if you can find them. So she found it. She texted me a picture, an image of what she found. And they're basically serpent rings. And I said, well, Google them, look them up. When were they made? 1st and 2nd century ancient Egypt, very popular in ancient Rome, imported to Rome. And so it opened her up, and she went, and then the other tip I gave her, this kind of goes to your earlier question, Tony. I said, when you go to sleep, take a nap or go to sleep, just say to yourself, hey, I want to open up and see what happens. So she said that to herself. And she went to sleep and she took a nap, and she had this really intense dream of being, in this temple and this and that, and there was a flood going on and whatever. And then she saw this guy standing in the hallway in her dream, and she thought she had woken up. So now she's in her dream thinking she's still dreaming, but she thinks she's woken up now. She was dreaming that she was in a dream, and then she thinks she's woken up, but she's still in the dream, okay? And she sees this guy, and she's talking to this guy who's wearing like a toga, it's, like from ancient Rome, or it's something like, or Greece or something. She doesn't know from where, but he's wearing a white toga, and he's got this plaque around him, and it's in this language that she could understand in her dream. It was in Latin. She could understand what it said. Anyway, and he's got remarkably golden, sparkly golden hair. So then she comes out of the dream, and she's following what I call following the breadcrumbs, right? And so because I had told her, I said, follow the breadcrumbs. Whatever you get, if anything comes, you just follow. So she goes online and she typed in. It's in my that story's in my first book. This one, I can't remember exactly what she typed in, but she typed in 3 words, something like Roman statue, something, and another word. Okay, and the busts of the same guy pops up from her dream. And then she didn't know who it was, so she looks it up, and the guy is Lucius Verus. Lucius Verus was co-emperor for 8 years before he died. Lucius Verus died young. He was co-emperor with Marcus Aurelius. All right, there's a whole story about that in my book. All right, my new book. But the interesting thing about Lucius Verus, you started to read about this guy. He's a really good-looking guy. He was a party animal, basically, what we would call a party animal today. And really good-looking, blonde, curly hair. So enamored with his blonde, curly, good-looking guy, curly hair, he would take gold dust and put it in his hair to make it sparkle even more. Real gold dust. because it's aristocracy, just putting gold dust in his hair when he felt like going out to party, right? And that's what she saw in her dream. And she realized, she connected the dots later. She realized that she had this memory of cutting his hair, and she looked up the story about that. And people can go look at that story, and you can figure out who she was.
Hey, do we have people on the live stream?
No, I don't have anybody right now, but
okay.
Yeah,
cool.
I hardly do them, so
yeah, that's fine.
Yeah.
But it's okay. It's there.
But that gives you something to kind of see how the breadcrumbs can be followed.
Very, very interesting. Now you have a book, Marcus Aurelius, right?
Yeah. Those are essays that I wrote about all those different topics, and I've collected them over the last 10 years. Yeah, it's interesting, the parallel between Marcus Aurelius's meditations, the ideas in that book and in my book. So people are going to see, and they're going to go, "Oh, that's interesting." So, because those people that don't know, Marcus Aurelius was a 2nd century emperor in Rome, but he was mainly a philosopher and mainly a thinker, and he didn't want to be emperor. He wanted to really be a philosopher. But as things went in the family and so forth, he obviously became emperor. But his ideas, what today is called Marcus Aurelius Meditations, is a book, but that he did not write it as a book. There were self-reflections. They were his own what we wouldn't call it a meditation technique, but we call it ruminations, contemplations, or that type of meditations about living life, self-reflections. And he wrote them every day. Almost every day he would write these reflections about himself and about how he could live in the world. And he is considered one of the most well-known Stoic philosophers about Stoicism, living life in a very practical way, and how to live life in a way that's not hurtful to others, and that helps oneself grow and fit in the universe. That's my summary of Stoicism. So, it wasn't meant to be a book. It was just his self-reflections, and somebody around, I think, 800 AD, I looked this up, but around 800 AD started collecting this stuff, and then it wasn't published till after the Gutenberg press, in 1400s or whenever that was. And then somebody started calling it Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, but he never intended to write it as a book. There was just personal self-reflections. Yeah, but my book is very similar in terms of the ideas that I express in this lifetime now as Kelvin Chin as I did then.
Did you have any questions?
I had the one that my friend wanted me to ask Kelvin.
Sure.
Which was, I'm not sure if I'm asking right. I said, what is God's opinion on the Bible today? I'm not sure if that's how he wanted to word it, but
God's opinion on the Bible today. So I assume when he says God, I assume he means, well, I won't assume. I'll tell you how I view this.
Okay.
So most people probably view Jehovah as God, the personality I know as Jehovah, as God or Allah or Yahweh. And Christians, just use the phrase God. But first of all, I don't even think you need to ask what God thinks of it. You just ask what we think of it, because what we know as humans, just from a religious historian perspective, the Bible is a collection of stories. First of all, you got the Old Testament and you got the New Testament, okay? So it's a collection of stories over many, 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 many thousands of years. That's what it is. And what people have to remember from a contextual standpoint is that it's known today that the literacy rate of the human population back when the Bible was written thousands of years ago was anywhere from 1 to 15%. In other words, 85 to 99% of the population was illiterate. Okay.
Okay.
So, and the closer you get to the 15%, those are the wealthier people, the more educated, et cetera, right? So the masses of people are probably closer to 1 to 2 to 3%. In other words, 98, 99% of the population was illiterate. So that means, how do you get these stories around? Verbal. So it's back to this thing we talked about earlier. It's sitting around in the kindergarten circle telling the story, except over thousands of years, not just over the 5 minutes you're sitting in the kindergarten class. You're talking thousands of years, and you're not just talking 25 people. You're probably talking 25,000 people or 250,000 people or some large number, right? Passing it around. Oh, I heard somebody said. And eventually you get to somebody who can write, and they write it down. Right? And that's what the Bible is. So you got to keep that in context, because the printing press in the West, in Europe anyway, not till the 1400s. Okay, Asians may have had it earlier, but we're talking about the Bible in Europe, in the Middle East and Europe. So you're talking the mid 1400s before the printing press. All right. Before that, you had monks who were writing and so forth. But even that's just for a couple hundred years before then, few hundred years. So, then the other context in terms of Bible and accuracy, you got to understand, if most people are referring to probably the New Testament, where Jesus is born and all of that, New Testament. Okay. Well, that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John was written anywhere from, the earliest religious historians think maybe 25 years after Jesus died, probably more like 45 years after he died, to 125 years.
And heavily influenced by Paul, as you mentioned.
Well, that's a whole other story. But let's just talking about the issue of hearsay and when somebody was writing the stuff. That's like you and I, the three of us, sitting and writing a Bible today about somebody who died in 1900. So somebody died in 1900. Who are we talking to? Who are we interviewing? We're not interviewing even the people who were with the person, because they were born in 1880. And 1880, that means today they'd be 140 years old. We're not interviewing anybody who's 140 years old, okay? So who are we interviewing today? We're interviewing maybe their children, probably their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren, at best. And then it's the levels of hearsay that we already talked about, right? So we're talking about generations later, after Jesus died, and blah, 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 blah. So you got that going on. Separately is the content. So that's just the accuracy thing I'm talking about. Separately, and the other thing is, the religious historians, they can read Luke, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They can tell that they're written by many different people. They don't know if it's 6 people or 60 people, but they can see, because you use certain diction, you use certain word choice, Mahesh, that's different from Tony, that's different from Kelvin, and our sentence structure is different. So you could see that. You can't see that in the King James Bible that's in the people's churches now, but you can see it in the original documents from long time ago.
Aramaic,
the Aramaic stuff that they think, they're not even sure, but they think it may be. But even the stuff that they think maybe, it's all over the place in terms of diction and sentence structure. That's separate from the content of the Paul stuff you're talking about, Tony.
Yeah. And then I'd also insert, like, for someone who's sincerely asking that question, what do you think about the Bible as it was for me? My whole thing is that a lot of the true history of humanity is lost at Constantinople, where basically the Catholic Church, what is now the Catholic Church, came in and kind of created this monotheistic narrative from what is clearly, if you ask scholars of ancient Pali, ancient Aramaic, of certain words that are now translated as God, which are really talking about a plurality of the mighty ones, or like the word Elohim is translated as God. Okay, but the Elohim is really a plural word. It's talking about those great ones from which we are all kind of ancestors. And so the whole true world history is severely distorted, and we're limited. People who now look at that right now, they're living in a little bit of a bubble.
Yeah.
Yeah. The meeting in Constantinople that was convened by Constantine the First, the first Roman emperor, Christian Roman emperor, it was in around 360 AD where they convened and they voted. This, like 300 plus bishops voted. And I just know this not because of past lives. I just know this because I researched it, because I teach an afterlife class. And one of the things I talk about is the idea of sin, punishment, and karma dharma, sin, and hell and punishment. And there is no such thing as hell. But this idea of hell came into the Bible through the book of Revelation that was voted in around 360 AD when they decided this is going to be the official Bible. So I researched that, and that's how I found that out. Yeah. So this is knowledge that people can find out. They don't have to ask God about it, Mahesh. They can just look at it, and because it's just known from looking at the documents from 360 AD, because these 300 bishops kept records of what they voted on and what the discussion was. And not all of them voted for to include the book of Revelations. A lot of them thought it was crazy stuff, but it was voted in, and that's how the idea of hell got into the Bible. Yeah. So there's a lot of political stuff, a lot of stuff like that.
Totally.
Speaking of political, what's your view? I don't mean to divert a little bit, but what's your view on where we are now as a country? Like what's happening with the wokeness and the feeling of this talk of white privilege and this political divide, all these things going on right now. That's actually why I got involved with this podcast, was to sort of like bring people back to the unification that you talk about in your book. And I think that was one of the key points I got reading your stories, was that if we all go back, we've been the slave. We've been the slave master. We've been,
Oh, we've been the murderer and the murdered. We've been the killer and the killed. I've killed people and I've been killed. And so, it's like we've all the ethnicity stuff. If people remembered some of their ethnic backgrounds, it would be huge. One of the things you and I were talking earlier about, one of your colleagues or somebody who was has some, let's just say, some strong emotional feelings towards Muslims. Let's just say.
Right.
And they're not positive. One of the things that, especially the folks who in your audience who knew who Maharishi Mahesh Yogi was, like some of us did, do still, and did, especially for me in the 60s, in the 70s. In that 30th November run up to organizing that talk that you mentioned, Tony, that happened in 2014, Maharishi had a whole bunch of different messages for different people. They were very personal messages that he wanted delivered to certain people who were very close to him in his life when he was alive, 20th century and 21st century planet Earth, as Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. For example, he had a very personal message for Jerry Jarvis. He had a personal message for Deepak and Deepak Chopra and Johnny Gray. So he had very personal messages for them that only Maharishi and that whoever that person is would know. He had said something to them first so that they would know that it was him, not somebody making this up. And so Maharishi, had these messages, and one of the messages was for the current Prime Minister of India, Prime Minister Modi. And let me back up for a sec. So when Maharishi died in 2008, he obviously saw Gurudev, his teacher. For those people who don't know, that's what he called his teacher, Gurudev, which just means great, great. Basically, it means great, amazing teacher, Gurudev. But his teacher's name was Swami Brahmananda Saraswati. For those people who don't know, Swami Brahmananda Saraswati, and who was a very highly respected, very well respected Indian sage, died in 1953, and he was Shankaracharya of the North. There were 4 seats, honorific seats, the kind of administrative spiritual seats in India, one in the North, South, East, and West. And he was the Shankaracharya, and he reluctantly, by the way, he reluctantly took that role as Shankaracharya of the North. He didn't want it because Gurudev, Swami Brahmananda Saraswati, who Maharishi calls Gurudev, he doesn't like being worshipped, so he took it, reluctantly. And he also was worried that he's going to say something and everybody would take it as the word of God and just blindly not think on their own. So Gurudev was really an incredible thinker kind of guy. A lot of people don't know because Maharishi just revered him and spoke about him, in a very reverential way, which is appropriate as his teacher. But anyway, when he died, Gurudev came to Maharishi and helped open up Maharishi to his past lives. Now, Maharishi was aware, I think, of some of his past lives, and there's some record if you go back and you listen to some of the videos, so forth. There are some videos of him referencing, he was very often, I heard him say this hundreds of times. He would say, reincarnation is for the ignorant. But what he meant by that is how did Maharishi define ignorance? He defined ignorance as non-enlightened, non-self-aware. Okay. That's how he defined ignorance. NPC. So if you were not a self-aware being, you were ignorant. He didn't mean ignorant like, oh, you didn't go to college, right. You couldn't do calculus. That's not what he meant by ignorant. He meant not self-aware,
right?
Not enlightened, okay? Because he still came from the Enlightenment, school of thinking, the Vedic tradition, right? So that's what he meant. So he said, because his belief system in the Vedic tradition is once you become enlightened, you don't have to reincarnate anymore. That's the thinking. Now he's readjusted that thinking. Now he's on the other side because Gurudev said, hey, Maharishi, we got to talk after he died. And so Gurudev opened him up to a lot of his, opened him up by saying what? Something like, I don't know what he said, but he said something to the effect of, this is what I've gotten from those on the other side. Something like, maybe you want to focus on your past lives. Maybe you want to look at that because maybe you want to learn something more about yourself. What does that teach you about some of the choices you made as Maharishi Mahesh Yogi? I'm parafrasing. I don't know.
Right. We got it.
But it was something like that.
Right.
But anyway, after Maharishi, Gurudev and then Shankara helped Maharishi also open up more to his past lives. One of his past lives memories, Maharishi's, was being a Muslim. So he was a Hindu as when he was with us, right? Mm-hmm. He was a Hindu. But one of his past lives, he was Shah Jahan. Shah Jahan, who not everybody's going to recognize that name, but I think everybody knows what the Taj Mahal is. And Shah Jahan built the Taj Mahal, which is it's really an edifice that's in which is buried his favorite wife. He was Muslim, so he had multiple wives. But his favorite wife, I can't remember her name, is buried in the Taj Mahal. It's a beautiful building, right? Maharishi Mahesh Yogi in a previous life was Shah Jahan. He was, and if you look up the Mughal Empire, Mughal, Mughal Empire, he was head of the Mughal Empire. It was big. It was all of India plus Pakistan, Bangladesh. It was like big, big empire. Anyway, the message for Prime Minister Modi of India, the current prime minister, was that he was a top minister of Maharishi's when Maharishi was Shah Jahan. So the current president Modi, prime minister of India, Modi, was a top minister of Shah Jahan's. He was a Muslim. This is what we were talking about, Mahesh, right?
Yeah.
You go back far enough,
that's
most
so
people
weird.
have been.
That's so weird because he didn't know that we were having this conversation about Modi with Alok, about Muslims. Look at that.
Right.
That's miraculous.
Right. And so that's a message for Modi to ease up, soften up on these anti-Muslim policies, dude. You were a Muslim too. in another lifetime.
But could the concern be fanaticism is what they're trying to put out the fire on? At least,
well, they may say that. They may say that. Whatever.
Okay.
But if you Wikipedia Modi, which I did a few years ago, that he's a controversial figure at best, because when he was president of some province long before, this is years before, I mean, I don't know when this was, 2003 or 4 or something like that, I think, something a long time ago, he told the police to stand down and when 3,000 or 4,000 Muslims were massacred in his province. So, so anyway.
Amazing.
Controversial.
Controversial. But this is that was a message from Maharishi to Modi after Maharishi died. This was one of his 2014 private messages to Modi. So I just just putting it out there. So it's like,
that's awesome. I mean, very timely for us, because we were just having this conversation before we even started talking on the WhatsApp yesterday about Modi, about Muslims, extremism, whatever. And this is like cha-ching. Somebody popped in and told Kelvin to bring this up. I mean, that's heavy. That's heavy.
Yeah.
So cool. Very, very cool. Very cool.
Before this podcast.
All those whisperings from the other side. Somebody was whispering from the other side.
Right, right.
And my most recent podcast was another friend from Fairfield, Andy Topol, who does the homotherapy. He went to Ukraine and did the homotherapy in Ukraine and put the ash in the river to neutralize the radiation. And he was actually saying in that episode that what we need is like this unification of spiritual leaders and all the religions to come together and realize, like, it's not about, Hindus doing this or Christians doing this, or we all got to work together because the earth is in serious need of spiritual work. Like, he envisions in his thing, what he wants to do is, let's say he goes to do homotherapy and some meditators show up and, some priests show up and some Buddhist monks show up, and they all are gathered somewhere doing meditation or their rituals or whatever at wherever the war is happening or whatever. That's his thing, right? That's what he wants to do. And I thought that's perfect. We need to get that thinking going, which is in line with what your book and what you are teaching and talking about, is the getting people to see and understand that we're all coming from the same place, right? We're all we're coming from different places, but we have all had a very more of a similar body of past experiences than people are willing to realize or recognize. That's the thing, that we're all more flawed and we're all have greater potential. Thou shalt not judge.
Than people realize, right? Right? And that we need to accept that those similarities, and by doing that, we see that we're not that, in your language, we're not as different as we think we are from each other. There's more similarities than there are differences in terms of the good, bad, and the ugly. And so, the people who are holier than thou are not as holy as they think they are. And the people who are, who are being stepped on even right now, we can help turn that around by understanding, why are they being stepped on? Why are people cruel to other people? That's another message that I talk about in my books, and like one of the things is love, Jesus's definition of love, and you guys know that I have this Jesus history as well. And so in my past lives, and his definition of love is accepting the other person for who they are, not who you wish they were. So it's a notion of acceptance, as opposed to trying to change the person into something, the model that you think that they should be. That's a violation of the person's free will. That's why people feel stepped on. Don't step on my toes. Let me be who I am. And so how can we influence and change people to be better? You can still do that. That's got to be educational. It's not by force. You cannot force somebody to change into something else. It has to be by shifting and educating them and showing them that the road they're going down may be actually a road of suffering as opposed to a road of contentment and inner peace and happiness. That's the approach, right? So accepting the other person for who they are, not who you wish they were. Now, that does not mean you kiss the person and hug the person who's holding a knife and is about to knife you in the back. No, that means you use your discernment by accepting them for who they are. Oh, it's the guy with the knife. And don't try to change them into the guy not with the knife because that's who they choose to be.
Right.
Can you educate the person who is holding the knife? Yes, that's a longer term project. The immediate thing is to walk on the other side of the street and get away from the person with the knife.
The realistic thing to do.
That's the thing. So this is the teachings of Jesus and other great seers that's been missed because most people are just, oh, you have to love them, you have to embrace them, and love, and peace.
The hippie movement,
yeah.
Right?
This is it's the Matthew. I don't remember it. I'm not a good biblical person at all, but so I don't remember the chapter and verse. But it's in Matthew where Jesus says something like, wise as a serpent and gentle as a dove, right? Something like that. But most people just remember the gentle part. They don't remember the wise as a serpent. You got to be smart. You got to be discerning. You don't do stupid stuff with people who are cruel to you. You leave. But in leaving them, you are still loving them by not trying to change them into something they don't want to be. That's his definition of love that I remember from being with him.
There's an art of war component in that too.
Yeah.
In understanding the enemy and loving and respecting the enemy because they define you.
Correct.
Yeah.
To some extent.
Yeah.
Because we're all reflecting. That's why people are attacked. That's why Jesus was attacked, because he was reflecting, and people saw their own insecurities and flaws and were like, they weren't paying enough attention to themselves, and so they lashed out at what they didn't like about themselves and kill him. Or someone else's person.
A lot of projection going on. You had the people who wanted him to be king. He had no interest in being king of the Jews. That's not his thing. And he's a teacher. He's a spiritual teacher. He still is, and he has been before he was Jesus, and he has been since he was Jesus. So he's a spiritual teacher. And then you have the Roman Pontius Pilate, and he didn't want to be there. He didn't want to be in Judea. He's in backwater. He wanted to be in a what he considered a good province.
Right.
He don't want any rabble rousing. Just shut up. Just deal with him. And the Sanhedrins, they got a power struggle going on with this guy who's building a flock around him, and they are like, we got to get rid of this guy because all of our tax money is going to go down the drain.
Totally.
It's like, what?
Totally.
Yeah.
So fascinating. And a lot of parallels going on right now. To get back to your question about politics and where we're at as a country and what have you.
Yeah, I think it's a lot of fear. And so how do we counter fear? That's basically, if you look at all my work I do, I teach meditation, I teach these classes on afterlife, I teach classes on how to live life and so forth, with forgiveness and so forth, and love, and and all this. How do you do that? You got to get rid of the fear. Fear is bugaboo. Fear of all kinds, not just fear of death, fear of losing power, fear of losing loved ones, fear of losing all kinds of stuff. It just creates a limited perspective and a limited ability to think clearly, bottom line.
That's the key point.
Yeah. I think that's a pretty good segue. We've covered a lot of material.
I feel like there's so much more to cover, but I understand we're all on the schedule. But
let's
do we want to cover the Charlie Lutes thing somehow?
Let's do that. Let's wrap it up with Charlie Lutes, because that's fascinating. A lot of people listening will
ask me something about that.
Well, let's see. There's the William Baldridge tie-in.
Yeah, William Baldridge, the William Baldridge story. So what happened with that was, this guy named William Baldridge, who I've now have become friends with him, but I didn't know him. And he found me on Facebook. I guess we met. He tells me we met, but at the 30th November event, actually, in 2014. But, there were so many people there. I was the organizer. I'm running around like a chicken with a head cut off, like trying to make sure this is happening. And they got the camera guy, the camera, all this, blah, blah, blah. And so is the caterer here for the food? All that kind of stuff. So I did meet him there, I guess, he tells me. But we actually, what I remember meeting him is on Facebook about 3 years ago. And he found me on Facebook because I'm a former TM teacher, and he's evidently a TM teacher. He's the first MIU student who graduated with a degree from MIU, because his name is Baldridge, so he is B, and so he's at the beginning of the alphabet. He was the first one to get an MIU diploma. And when he was studying, evidently, he told me this just 3 years ago, this whole story. When he was studying in Goleta, California, in Santa Barbara County, was where MIU started. It didn't always used to be in Fairfield, Iowa. Not everybody knows that. But it started in some rental buildings in Goleta, in Santa Barbara County, out here on the West Coast in 1973. So he was there as a student. And I guess a bunch of the students used to go down regularly to this weekly lecture by this guy named Charlie Lutes. And I didn't know Charlie Lutes. I mean, I knew who he was, but I didn't, never heard his lectures or study with him, because he was head of this spiritual arm of the TM organization, which I had nothing to do with. He was head of
realization,
SRM, Spiritual Regeneration Movement, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, SRM. And so I was part of SIMS, Students International Meditation Society, International Meditation Society, SIMS and IMS, which we taught in science and education, students, schools and stuff, and in the Army, as you mentioned, we taught up at West Point and so forth. So we had nothing to do with Charlie Lutes's organization. We were with Jerry Jarvis's arm of the organization. And let's just say Jerry and Charlie kind of didn't see eye to eye. We'll leave it at that. So back in the 60s, they've worked it out on the other side, I hear. But anyway, so William Baldridge tells me 3 years ago that these guys, these MIU students, used to go down to LA and hear Charlie Lutes lecture weekly. And one of the lectures, somebody in the audience asked Charlie Lutes if there was anybody in the TM organization or anybody today. I think the way they asked it, they didn't ask it about TM organizations. They said, anybody today, alive today, who walked with Jesus? And Charlie Lutes, this is 1973, okay, said yes. In fact, he's a TM teacher in the TM organization now. And he was also the Apostle Peter. And he was also the great military and strategist Frederick the Great, King of Prussia. So Widge, William Baldridge, his nickname is Widge. Widge is telling me this 3 years ago, thinking that I told Charlie Lutes that I had those past life memories. I didn't have my past life memories till 1977 they started. This was 4 years before I had any memories. And so this kind of blew me away, quite frankly, because I'm the science background guy, skeptical, like, wondering if I'm making this stuff up still, And then he tells me this 3 years ago that Charlie Lutes was talking about, and evidently he's told us the hundreds of people, or a lot of people in the lecture, and I heard from some people recently, some former SRM people who heard this separately, from Charlie Lutes as well. Turns out Charlie Lutes, I don't know if your audience knows, but Charlie Lutes was the Roman centurion in that past life 2,000 years ago at Jesus's crucifixion. So Charlie Lutes was the first person he got a download from Jesus and was teaching in Rome. Charlie Lutes was the first teacher of Jesus's teaching in Rome. I followed him there a bunch of years later with my daughter. Wow. My daughter then. So these memories came up to me in 1977 that I talk about, where I was crucified upside down and so forth. And I didn't even know which king of Prussia I was until 2014. So this was, whatever the math is, 1973, 2014, Charlie Lutes is talking about stuff that resurfaced in my memory in 1977, 79, and then completed in 2014.
Wow.
Pretty wild.
Yeah.
It kind of blew me away.
Cue Twilight Zone music.
I know. Cue Twilight Zone. Exactly.
Yeah. I mean,
Really?
it's... There you go.
Yeah, and I had just become, evidently, as I said, when in 1973 did he say this? And these guys went back and they checked in, like recently, they checked with each other, the ones who actually were in the audience and who heard him say this. And they said it was like fall or winter 1973. Well, I became a TM teacher in May of 1973.
You mentioned you take an understanding approach rather than a religious approach or therapy approach. Could you elaborate on what you mean, or how it differs from other approaches?
Yeah. So my approach, because I come from a science background. I'm a rational. I like think things through logically. And you see in my new book, when I talk about my past lives, you can see this goes back even long before science exists. Science as scientific thinking, as we know, existed.
Right.
I've been a rational, a philosophical thinker for thousands of years. It's just the way my personality is. And that's, of course, the theme in the book is our personalities do continue from lifetime to lifetime. And you'll see how it expresses is different ways. The personality traits can express more this way and more that way in different lifetimes. But in terms of your question, my understanding has always been there. It's like how how to analyze things to understand things more clearly. So that's one of the two prongs, I call it, of my approach of dealing with anything in life, is looking at it from how can we think about it more clearly? Is there a different perspective? Is there a different approach, the way we can look at things? And then shine a light on it in a slightly different way. Oh, and then we have a clearer vision of an understanding, therefore, about whatever the concept is, whether it's death and dying or anything else I'm talking about with people. And then the other prong of the approach is experiential. It's what? It's the turning within part. It's the connecting with ourselves. It's the expanding our conscious capacity of experience. So back in the old TM days in the 1970s, when I taught, one of the things that we used to say, or some of us used to say anyway, we used to talk about you got the container of knowledge and you got the knowledge. So most people are just taking the same size container and just filling it up with more knowledge. It's just getting crowded in there, and it get confused even. So in turning within, or in meditating of a type of meditation that's going to expand your capacity, that's expanding the container of knowledge. We make the container bigger. We can put more knowledge in. It can be more organized. But in terms of your question, I don't want to just help my students put more knowledge in. I want them to give them perspectives on how to reorganize it or how to think about it differently. That's the understanding component. And then there's the expanding the capacity component is the experiential.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
All right. I mean, anything else you want to cover, Kelvin? Because I'm sure we can go on for days.
We could do a whole other session, man. It's like, yeah.
Well, let's do that.
Okay.
Let's just
Yeah.
plan to do that.
Do that. Yeah, we'll do another one.
Yeah, I had fun. And I think and it's so relevant to everything that's going on right now, dude.
Totally.
Huge.
Totally.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
And so,
because everybody in this time is experiencing massive purification, and how they experience it depends on their container of knowledge, how pure the water is in the glass,
and how big their container is.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And so this should be, people should be able to, reflect on this, no matter where they're at, who they are.
Well, I'm gonna post links to that talk in there, and when I do the re-edits, I will have some cutaways to it. While in my other shorter versions to this,
Sounds good.
And in the links down below, I'll have all the links to the books where you can get it.
Yep.
Great.
And
like, share, subscribe, post it on Facebook, share it with your friends.
Yeah, very cool.
Yeah,
awesome.
This is
That'd
great
be great.
stuff, and it's
stuff.
it's definitely an honor to have met you, to spend this time with you.
Yeah,
thank you
very fun.
so much for that, and look forward to many more stories and reflecting and having conversations with our mutual friends over the years ahead.
Yeah, sounds good, man. We'll do it again. Just let me know.
All right. Thank you,
right.
Kelvin.
Thanks,
we
Kelvin,
appreciate
man.
it. See you on the
Take
next
care,
one.
buddy.
Sure. Yeah.